Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Racial Justice Summit. My name is Kimberly Bennett, and I am the Communications Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which is a co-host of this summit with the Urban Alliance on Race Relations. I will be your MC for this morning's brief session. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I would first like to welcome Michael K. Mitchell, the Indigenous elder who will be providing a welcome to you all. Michael Kenentakaron Mitchell is a Wolf Clan faith keeper of the Mohawk Nation of the Akwesasne. He has served his community of Akwesasne as Grand Chief of the Mohawk Council for 32 years before retiring in 2015. As a longtime respected leader in Canada, today, Michael devotes his time as a knowledge keeper in community, regional, and national First Nations meetings. Michael, over to you.
So, I want to bring greetings to all the different peoples that are gathered for this meeting. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone, and I've been asked if I would say a Thanksgiving acknowledgement. And the way it goes with our First Nations from a long time ago, they select a speaker when people of different nations came together. And in that way, the speaker would start. He would start by acknowledging our Mother Earth, for everything that gives us life comes from her. And so all those that are gathered would all in their minds say, we are honored to have lived another day, and we acknowledge the waters, the land, the tree life, the bird life, the animal life, the four winds. We acknowledge our brother sun. We acknowledge Grandmother Moon, and beyond the heavens. And when they say this, they say it separately. And each and every one of them is honored, acknowledged by those that are gathering. What I'm saying is said very fast because they take the time carefully to put emphasis on every aspect of creation. And when a speaker acknowledges each and every one that have attended, we will do that as well. For all those people that have come to this gathering, attend this meeting, we only ask, after giving that acknowledgement, in the language of the nation that he is from. I'm from the Mohawk Nation in Akwesasne, and I've been a faith keeper for many years. And in our ceremonies, we also acknowledge the life cycle, and we tribute to all of life, every aspect, all the seasons, all the foods, ceremonial, the life that is around us, and that we respect each and everything that gives us life. And so in the oldest times, we acknowledge each other. For the Creator gave us life that is sacred. And in giving us life, we acknowledge everything around us with great respect. With great respect, we thank the Creator for the life we have today. With great respect, we acknowledge each other. The Creator gave his life, and he gave us peace, peace of mind. And through ceremony, we acknowledge all other living things in the world. We all come from different nations, and we're all given these sacred traditional teachings to have respect for Mother Earth, to have respect for everything that gives us life, to all of creation. And those are the thoughts that I've been asked to say that will open this meeting, because we cannot have a meeting of people without having sincere thoughts of peace, sincere thoughts of sharing of minds, sharing of history, sharing of what is in your heart. And so today, those are the words that I've been given to say to you. And that will open today's meeting, which by custom, I'll give an executive version of it because I have to say this in my own language. That is our connection to the land. Every nation on this land has their own language. And that includes
Sorry, I think the microphone got muted somehow for the last part.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I'm sort of lost here. I'm at the tail end of the Thanksgiving greetings. Did you hear the first part?
Yeah, most of it except the last maybe 30 seconds, 15, 20 seconds.
Okay. We're going to wind up by acknowledging each and every one of you. And for the life cycle that we have on earth, we'll be at peace in our hearts and minds. We'll be at peace with all of creation, starting with Mother Earth. And so every day in our meetings, we give thanks. Thanks for the life that we have, for the health and well-being of our families, of our nations that we belong to. And so with those words, your meeting will now open in a good way, with a good mind and respect for each other. Your meeting is now open.
Thank you so much, Michael, for those profound words of welcome. And now we're going to hear from our co-hosts. We'll welcome the Executive Director of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations to provide some opening remarks. Nathan Shan.
Thank you, Kimberly, for opening this session, and thank you, Alda Mitchell, as well for your presence and for your greetings and blessings to start this event. I'm joining from Scarborough. Many of us are joining from different parts of the country. I'm joining from the land that is traditional territories to many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and Hautenosaunees, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As a settler myself, and I'm committing myself to continue to learn, continue to be in solidarity, but also as someone who fled a genocide, and I extend my deepest sense of solidarity to the indigenous peoples of this land facing continuous impact of colonialism and genocide. We titled this session Pandemic Awakening, not assuming that everybody's woke now, but there was a sense of clear acknowledgement that was coming over the pandemic, as you saw. In the early stages, everybody said, we are all on the same boat, and it was not true. The storm was the same, but we were all in different boats, and we were all in situations where we were historically disadvantaged and weren't able to face the brunt of the pandemic. So the racial inequities that existed within the society, within Canada, got exposed. It's not that they were new. It's not that they came out of the pandemic. It actually were just exposed and exacerbated. So we wanted to make sure that we do this summit in the context of that awakening, but also the grassroots movements, particularly Black Lives Matter movement, that has brought a lot of systems to start to acknowledge, start to become a bit more responsive. Today the systems are forced to respond. The systems that didn't use the word racism are using systemic racism. Many of them are releasing statements to say, we want to address anti-Black racism. So this hasn't happened because of goodwill of the system. This happened because of people on the grassroots who have put their lives, put their opportunities, put their safety on the line to do it. So as we gather as a group on a weekday in the morning, let's remember those activists who actually made what's happening today very possible. And so the denial of racism is starting to be questioned. The acknowledgement of systemic racism is happening. But let's not kid ourselves. We always have to measure progress based on the magnitude of the problem. What is happening, if you compare to what the real magnitude of the problem of racism, we wouldn't be happy with where we are. There's a long way to go, and there's a long way to get real results, because we know systemic racism and white privilege and white supremacy is an adaptive animal that just finds its way to recalibrate itself with new terminologies and new ways of doing things and still keeping status quo. So we know now that the systems use the same words that we might want them to use, but not necessarily do the same thing we would like it to be, or at least not in the scale that we would like it to be. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we want people who are working on the field to be here to offer solidarity, to face that collective struggle together, because I know there's burnout, I know there's health impact of people who are doing this work. So we hope, this summit will provide a space to at the end, almost at the end of the year, to come together, share ideas, find solidarities, find allyship, but more importantly, look forward to a stronger year and stronger push next year. Urban Alliance has been around for 46 years doing this work, and we are proud of the work that we've been able to do. But I would say, we are just one piece in the puzzle, and sometimes what we do is not enough, and we need to acknowledge that what we do is not enough. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that people who do this work have to find ways in which they are feeling positive about this, feeling hopeful about this as well. I want to finish off by saying thanks to all the speakers, volunteers, our partner. First time we are partnering with Kenyan Race Relations Foundation to do this work. It's been an amazing experience to work together with the staff team there, and very inspirational to see the direction CRF has taken as well, and all the sponsors that made this possible. I don't have the exact number, but I think 90% or more of the attendees in this 700 plus attendees forum are coming in for free as a free summit. So that was only made possible by the support. And I want to particularly acknowledge Hannah Medina, who was the event coordinator for this session. I just wanted to finish off by saying, we tried to get a kind of a spectrum of speakers that would take on, different perspectives and different communities, different lived experiences and so on. But this is just a conversation starter. And that's why we have the breakout session. Many of you who are joining could potentially be on the panel as well. So we have the second hour dedicated to it. If we weren't able to capture all thoughts, we just wanted to give a sense of where things are at and how the conversation can begin. Some of the speakers may not be where we want to be. Some of the speakers may be far ahead of where we want to be, but it's always good to have this conversation and build together, because we have to do this work together. It cannot be put on the shoulders of just a few people to confront this big issue. So this is not just a time to talk. All of these sessions, all of these systems that we are exploring are the systems that Urban Alliance is working on. So it's almost like our summit to come together and start building ideas and taking this work into the next year. So we look forward that you will join us as partners, as volunteers, as members, as co-creators to do this work in 2022 moving forward as well. Thank you very much. And please use hashtag RJSummit21 to amplify the thoughts that are being shared, and really looking forward to listening to a lot of the conversations coming up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and thank you for bringing perspective to the objective of this summit. Now, I would like to welcome the Honorable Minister Ahmed Hussain. Minister Hussain was appointed Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion in the recently formed cabinet last month. He had a long career advocating on issues of inclusion and equity. Minister Hussain, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and to offer some words of reflection on racial justice. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, and good morning to all of you. It is my pleasure to join all of you in this Racial Justice Summit 2021. My remarks will be brief because that's what I've been told to do, but I just wanted to highlight a number of things. As Nathan said, the work continues. It is important to recognize the different aspects and the different angles that we have to take to push these issues. Key to it is measurement. I mean, if you can't even measure the problem and the impacts that it is having through different institutions, then you can't track it. And if you cannot track it, you can't make progress. So I think, you know, we all know the challenges. Obviously, they manifest themselves through different measurements. For example, obviously, employment is a key one. Housing is another one. You know, overrepresentation in both provincial and federal prisons. The statistics are quite shocking. If you look at the growth in and the overrepresentation of racialized Canadians in federal prisons, for example, it is quite shocking. And particularly, I mean, it is bad enough for all racialized communities, but particularly for Indigenous and Black Canadians, it's on another level. And so part of what we need to do is to, you know, get rid of mandatory minimum sentences, which have not kept Canadians safe. And the only thing that they've done is dramatically increased the overrepresentation of racialized Canadians, particularly Indigenous and Black Canadians in our prisons. The second one is bring back things called conditional sentence orders that allowed people who were not a threat to their family or their community to serve their time upon conviction, to serve their sentence in the community, i.e. house arrest. And that what that would do is improve the chances of integration, enable folks to keep their home, enable people to be able to go to school or work or both. And you can't do that if you're sent to prison. So conditional sentence orders were eliminated by the previous government. Under C-22, we presented that piece of legislation before the election, and we were going to bring back conditional sentence orders for all kinds of offenses. But that piece of legislation has died because of the election, and now we have to bring it back. And we promised Canadians that we will bring it back within 100 days. The third one is the really ground shifting work that Statistics Canada is doing. As I said, they're now measuring things. For the first time in July 2020, in Canada's modern history, July 2020 was the first time we had a jobs report that had disaggregated data by race. And so we know, for example, on July 2020, what is the unemployment rate for everyone, and then what's the unemployment rate for Asian Canadians, what's the unemployment rate for African Canadians, and so on. We've never had that kind of data before. And already it's making an impact in terms of policy making, because when you have better data, when you can show the disproportionality in terms of overrepresentation in prisons or unemployment or other figures, then you know it informs policy making. It makes better policies coming out of the federal government. And I hope this is something that can be obviously replicated by those who are already not doing it. Those who are already doing it, even before StatsCan, I want to say thank you to everyone in the room and beyond who has fought for that. Disaggregated data is really key to a lot of the work that needs to be done in order to dismantle these systemic barriers. Economic development is another one, but hand in hand to that is also making sure that we invest in the capacity and infrastructure of organizations in racialized communities that have done so much for so long with so little. And again, for the first time as long as I can remember with the federal government, this is the first government that has invested and continues to invest significant amounts of money in the building of capacity in racialized communities, particularly Black Canadians. And the reason for that is because when you build capacity, you enable organizations to provide more programming, but to just do more services and reach more people, have a bigger impact. As I said, criminal justice reform for me is a priority. Even before I was given this new portfolio of diversity and inclusion, in addition to housing, I was already doing that before even I joined cabinet. So I think criminal justice reform has to be central to what we're doing. The second one is economic development. The third is capacity building and being there for the organizations that do so much. And then the data, disaggregated data across the board, whether it's through our whole systems of government service delivery, whether it's healthcare, education, law enforcement, and so on. And finally, the one thing I'll say is that I think there's been some steps taken to have a very deliberate lens to be brought to money that was going out during COVID to help Canadians, to really bring a racialized lens to that, to an equity lens, I should say, to that spending. I don't think it's across the board with every ministry, but I certainly try to do that with the Emergency Community Support Fund and the number of other programs that EHDC was getting out the door. We really made sure that we demanded from the system a proactive plan to ensure that that money will be distributed in an equitable manner, both to the organizations that were delivering those services, but also to the populations that would be reached by those funding. And I'm happy to say that that had quite an impact in terms of shocking the system to do things better. And then we demanded rolling reports so that when they didn't live up to those plans, or when there was a gap, we could address those gaps with additional funding. So I'm just giving you a highlight of some of the things that we're doing at the federal level, but I know there's a lot of work being done with different orders of government, but also more critically and more importantly in the nonprofit sector. And I'm very, very appreciative of listening to the other participants in this meeting, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Minister Hussain, for explaining to us what the government is working on and how much we have to do to make the society more equitable for racialized Canadians. Right now, I'd like to bring to the virtual stage Mohamed Hashem, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, to say a few words. But before he comes to the stage, I would like to remind everyone that there is a racial justice website, and that is, the address is www.racialjusticesummit.com, where you'll find the agenda for the summit, information about our speakers, as well as the summit booklet. We have a full program in which we will be exploring racism in the sectors of education, media, health, justice, employment, and government. There will be 6 sessions over the next 2 days, and we anticipate seeing over 700 people join us throughout the course of this 2-day summit. And with that, I'll put Mr. Hashem on stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, Minister Hussain and Ethan and Elder Mike Mitchell for giving us your remarks. You know, before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. It is now home to many First Nations and Inuit and Métis. The last 2 years have been a bit of an emotional wreck for this country. We saw the murder of George Floyd, where everybody reacted to the moment in a way where, to be frank, I had never seen before. People from the corporate sector, from labor, from government were reacting to anti-Black racism in a very in a much stronger way. Something that none of us had seen for a long time. We saw a spike in anti-Asian racism. Vancouver is now seen as the anti-Asian racism capital of North America because of the huge spike in incidents and hate crimes over there. We've seen members of the Jewish community who have seen an unprecedented amount of anti-Semitism rise over the last year as well. Hate crimes against synagogues have gone up, and there's a level of fear that's settling in amongst many who are older. We hear 2 weeks ago, I was in Calgary, and I was speaking to Chinese seniors, an organization was serving Chinese seniors, and many people were afraid to leave their homes because of the level of fear that they have of what's out there. And then, of course, we saw 4 people getting killed in London, Ontario. Once again, the Muslim communities of Canada were reminded of the deadliness of Islamophobia. They, over time, the level of threats have come up and come down, but some were feeling after Donald Trump had left office that things are going to get cooler. But instead, what happened was that we saw more blood on the streets. And then in that moment of sorrow, we got the news of what happened in Kamloops. The discovery of the 250 unmarked graves then shocked this nation. And that level of collective sorrow and sadness and acknowledgement is something that honestly I have not witnessed in a very long time. So it's been an emotional 2 years for a lot of us on top of the pandemic. And so last week we did a study to find out how Canadians were reacting to the last 2 years in terms of race relations. What we saw was that awareness around racism and systemic racism in particular had gone up, but that people felt that the future looks more bleak, that that it is difficult for them to see it getting better, because and we believe that when there's awareness, you see responses from people to say, yes, we should do better, yes, we should do better. But if people don't feel that things are getting better, then they feel disappointed for things not moving the dial. And this summit here is our way of responding to that. Part of the reason why we think that at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation believe that the reason why that disappointment exists is because the expectations of the population are not being met, and that means out in workplaces, within their communities, within policing, within the criminal justice system, within structures and institutions, within laws and legislation. People's expectations are higher, and what they're seeing is much lower. So this conference here is our way of responding. What we acknowledge is that sometimes race relations comes off as controversial because people want to say something that is harder, that is harsher, but may not be acceptable today. But what it does is that, 4 years down the line, what was unacceptable back then is now acceptable today. So I want to encourage you to have difficult conversations in which you can say, and you can go beyond the normal parameters of what you think is acceptable in terms of being able to push for a solid, harder, sense of racial justice. And I think that this conference is a place for you to do so. I just want to say there's a lot of work that needs to get done. There's facial recognition policies and guidelines that are being developed for the use by police, which is a huge concern for many people. Disaggregated data, Statistics Canada is looking at disaggregated data for corrections in particular and revising those pieces. The employment data Minister Hussain mentioned around over the last year, we've done a study of that particular data, and we'll be releasing it in the next couple of weeks to talk about how Black, Indigenous, particularly women, have been more impacted than anybody else by this pandemic. Employment equity remains a major focus. Online hate remains a major focus. Policing remains a major focus. Let's have the hard conversations and let's find solutions that are going to bring things forward. And before we go, I just want to say thank you to our amazing team of staff people who put this together. So Amir Al-Khawabi, Sharon Pun, Kimberly, thank you very much for the CRF team, Anna Medina from the Urban Alliance team, and all those who have contributed towards this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohamed. Finally, I would like to put in the spotlight those who've made this summit possible. And we would be remiss without thanking our faithful sponsors for this event. And as such, we'd like to thank our platinum sponsor, the United Food and Commercial Workers, for their generous support. And we would like to invite Anouk Collet, Executive Assistant to the National President of the UFCW Canada, to say a few words for us.
Thank you, Kimberly. It's really an honor to be with you today. And I'd like to thank the UARR for hosting this important summit. I join you today from Montreal, historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, but recognized to be located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Mohawk Nation. In partnership with Ontario UFCW Local 102, 175, and 1006A, we are proud to support this summit. Nationally, we represent 250,000 union members working in over 26 sectors of the economy, but mainly in food processing, grocery retail, hospitality, and healthcare. As Nathan and Mohamed mentioned before, the pandemic highlighted pre-pandemic inequities that have systemically undermined the rights of Black, Indigenous, and racialized persons. We also know that BIPOC workers are disproportionately represented in sectors which have experienced the worst case counts of COVID-19. However, if there is one good thing about the pandemic, is that it has shown the importance of the work of our members as they stood on the front line and kept the economy going, and took care of our ill ones. Really, what we've done throughout the pandemic is what we've done historically, which is to be responsive to our members' needs and to try to protect their health and safety as best as we could. Among other things, we pushed hard for protective measures and we demanded paid sick days for frontline workers who were risking their lives every day. And despite the pandemic, we also pursued our work on many other issues. And because we're committed to supporting the advancements of women and racialized peoples into leadership roles across our union, in March 2021, we hosted for the first time our Women and Racialized Leaders Institute. We also support the discussion on anti-Black racism, anti-Asian hate, and the elimination of Islamophobia. And in the coming weeks, we'll release our anti-racism bargaining guide, which will be available on our website. Lastly, we launched the #StopTheHate campaign. We believe that racial justice is very much tied to inoculating society against hate, and we invite you to show your support for this campaign by visiting our website. But now that we are slowly coming out of the pandemic and looking at the recovery, we are asking yourselves the same question that you will be asking yourselves today and tomorrow. What's next? We strongly believe that the government needs to work on the creation of an inclusive safety net in a post-pandemic recovery. And to do that, the government must acknowledge the plight that BIPOC workers continued facing during this pandemic. A post-pandemic recovery that is anti-racist can be a great equalizer between those who have and those who need it the most. And to achieve this, we look forward to continuing to work together with you in pushing for these necessary changes. So have a great summit, and thank you.
Thank you, Anouk. I would like again to welcome everyone to the Racial Justice Summit, and we will be kicking off this summit with our first session on racial justice and policing. This session will be moderated by Shallima Maharaj, a reporter and journalist for Global News Toronto. But before we pass the microphone on to Shallima, we will watch a brief video from our sponsor, and then we will begin our session on racial justice and policing.
Just unmuting myself there. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the 2021 Racial Justice Summit. Panel 1, Racial Justice and Policing. As you just heard there, my name is Shallima Maharaj, and I'm a reporter. I'm an anchor with Global News, and I am incredibly pleased to be welcoming you and to be coming to you from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa of the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And we also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And this session here is going to focus on the theme of racial justice and policing, and it brings together a diverse group of experts who will discuss their current work and ways to address the state of policing today. Now, the past year, we know, has been marked by global attention to issues in policing. We have watched people converge on city streets in protest of police brutality. There have been calls to defund the police. And while social media and news coverage may have drawn more attention to the issues, there's been a great deal of tireless advocacy work that has been happening for some time. And that brings me to our panelists. And in keeping with the summit's theme of pandemic awakening, what's next? They will be speaking about their work and how it will continue beyond this year. So our first panelist is Moya Teklu. Moya is the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Black Legal Action Center. Moya has a long history of working to combat anti-Black racism in the justice system. At Legal Aid Ontario, she developed a plan that resulted in the delivery of clinic law services to hundreds of Black Ontarians. Now, Moya helped bring together and provide staff support to the inaugural board of the Black Legal Action Center and authored LAO's Racialized Communities Strategy. She has also delivered anti-racism training to hundreds of judges, justices of the peace, lawyers, regulators, adjudicators, and educators across the country. And in 2019 and 2020, she was an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. So we're very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Next, I want to talk about Yusuf Bakiri, who founded the Justice for Soli movement in 2016. It is a grassroots, national-based organization after the tragic death of his brother, Soliman Faqiri. He is passionate about advocating within the justice system for vulnerable Canadians who suffer from mental illness. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and History from Wilfrid Laurier University, a diploma in French from the University of Laval, and a postgraduate certificate in Public Administration from Humber College. Thank you for being with us, Yusuf. And next, I want to talk about Mohamed Shuriye. He is currently the manager of the City of Toronto's Policing Reform Unit. He has worked in various positions in his 9 years at the Toronto Public Service, including most recently at the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit as a Policy Development Officer. Mohamed was an Action Canada Fellow in 2019 and 2020, a national fellowship program that focuses on strategic policy issues affecting Canada. And next I want to talk about Andrea Vasquez Jimenez. Her pronouns are she, her, hers. She is an Afro-Latina born in Toronto. She is co-founder and director of Latinx Afro-Latin America Abiyala Education Network. She was also a lead organizer for the successful removal of the Toronto District School Board's School Resource Officer Program and is currently the lead organizer, coordinator, and campaign strategist for the Provincial Police Free Schools Ontario and National Police Free Schools Canada campaigns. Now, Andrea also consults organizations and school boards on change management as it relates to police-free schools. She is part of an international push for police-free schools, working with others, including in the US and the United Kingdom. So a lot of very, very accomplished people we are talking to here today, who no doubt will have a lot of insights to offer in the discussion here. Now, throughout the course of this discussion, we're going to delve into a number of different issues. I will remind everyone you'll have between 3 and 5 minutes each for a total of 20 minutes here to discuss the issues. But of course, we're going to start off here talking about a poll by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which found that racialized groups are less likely to perceive police as doing a good job compared to white people. So here's the question. How would you describe the general relationship between racialized communities and law enforcement? And what are we missing when we are talking about the issue? I'm going to start off with Yusuf. Your time begins now.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I greet respected brothers and sisters with peace, with the greetings of peace to each and every single one of you. I want to sincerely thank my brothers Nithan and Mohamed Hashem and all the wonderful team on both organizations for organizing this event, and Shallima and the wonderful panelists to give me an opportunity to speak with you. It's an important question, but I like to add with this, the name of this discussion we call racial justice and policing. Let's remove the word justice here. The term in itself, we know what that means, but in a way, there is no justice within policing when there is no accountability. And when there's no accountability, there is no transparency. And so to answer the question, Shallima, it is unfortunately the relationship, that is to say, the relationship is effectively poor for multiple reasons. And it's poor because the system has a two-tier system for law enforcement and the rest of us Canadians across the nation. And that's linked to the lack of oversight and a lack of transparency. I believe it's important to engage with police. It's important to engage from the perspective of trying to come to a middle ground. But from our perspective, from our cultural competency, and the reason it's poor is because of the lack of cultural competency. You know, when we talk of racial communities, racialized communities, we're not a monolith. Everyone has their respective richness and their culture that, for example, that cultural competency is between life and death. And there's names that I've written here, whether it's the tragic story of Andrew Loku, or Mature Medot, or Pierre Corleone, or Ijaz Chowdhury, right? Imagine if you had somebody from the Sudanese community, from the Pakistani community, right? Who, or from the Haitian community that spoke to the, that was a police officer or like a frontline worker. This is life and death. And this would probably have saved them. And so, I can say a lot, but out of respect for the time, I think it's poor because the cultural competency isn't there, and we both have a role, us and policing. And the other reason that it's poor is that the system will not create justice for anyone within policing that suffers when there is no accountability. These conversations will continue. And that's why we are at a crossroads in the history of this nation. We don't need to see more George Floyd tragedies, or Regis Korshinsky-Paquette tragedies, or Jas Chowdhury tragedies, or just a couple months ago in Montreal, where I'm speaking today from the traditional Mohawk First Nation. There was a tragedy of a man who's suffering from mental illness of Haitian descent. He lost his life, right? This will keep happening again if the cultural competency isn't there and the transparency. And we as a society have to hold policing and law enforcement accountable. That two-tier system needs to stop. May God bless every single one of you. And thank you for that question, Shallima.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. I want to now put that same question here to Mohamed. So I'll just reiterate what that question is again. How would you describe the general relationship between racialized communities and law enforcement, and what are we missing when we are actually talking about the issue.
Thank you, Shallima. And I think I want to build and echo the comments of Brother Yusuf to thank everybody for organizing this conference today, the Urban Alliance on Race Relations and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. But I also want to build on his comments around it's a question of trust and confidence. And I think that's severely what we need to get to. You know, people have been sharing their stories around the lack of trust and the lack of confidence in policing, but now we have data to show that. We now seen the recent report by the Ontario Human Rights Commission that Black communities in Toronto are disproportionately arrested, charged, and subjected to use of force. We've seen that Black Torontonians are 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by police. And now no comparable data exists necessarily for our Indigenous brothers and sisters, but we have seen nationally that, and Minister Hussain spoke on this, that Indigenous populations in Canada are only about 4%, but they represent close to 29% of inmates in our federal institutions, and also are disproportionately represented in our provincial institutions. I also want to highlight that the experiences of our LGBTQ2S communities also indicate that there is a lack of trust and confidence in policing. A recent report done by Justice Epstein that was a report on the review of missing persons investigations found that 47% of respondents who identified as LGBTQ2S indicated no confidence in policing compared to 19% who were heterosexual. And the numbers were even more staggering for our trans and non-binary respondents who indicated that 71% expressed that view. So I think this underscores the experiences of people who are facing marginalization. I think it highlights that policing, like many institutions in our country, have to address systemic discrimination that is at the root of some of these institutions. And I think to answer your second question around, you know, what are we not talking about? I think we sometimes, when we focus on policing, we miss that there is an enforcement approach broadly that needs to be talked about. We see this enforcement approach at our border with the Canadian Border Security Agency. We see this enforcement approach in our schools. We see this enforcement approach in our parks. We saw it recently when COVID hit in terms of how our parks were, the enforcement that was done in our parks was disproportionately against marginalized communities who didn't have public spaces, who had nowhere to go, and they were ticketed the most. So I think we got to talk about enforcement approaches more broadly. We need to reimagine these approaches, and we need to dismantle systemic discrimination in all our institutions.
All right, thank you very much for that, Mohamed. And just to reiterate the question for anyone who's just joining us now in this conversation, we are talking about the general relationship between racialized communities and law enforcement and what we are missing when we're having the discussion. So right now, I'm going to direct that question to Andrea.
Thank you so much. And I definitely want to start off with, you know, this isn't necessarily something that has been missing. Community has been advocating for abolition. So when we're actually taking the abolitionist framework, and, you know, I really want to highlight the work of Black abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore, talking about abolition is not just about absence, but it's about presence, right? And it's about building life-affirming institutions. And so when we're really looking at having, you know, healthy, equitable, life-affirming spaces for everyone, the system of policing, the institution of policing, there is no room for the existence of such an institution, right? So I really want us to bring it back all the way that it's not just about, you know, reforms. We've been doing reforms from time, right? It hasn't been working. There has just been even more so like a co-optation. So even looking at right now, within the past 2 years, because of, you know, more of these global uprisings against police brutality, we have been seeing kind of this like co-optation of equity, diversity, anti-oppression, anti-racism. And what's particularly extremely dangerous when we have an institution that is embedded in anti-Blackness, is embedded in its nature, anti-indigeneity and so forth, and an ongoing, you know, perpetuation of colonization and white supremacy, even enslavement, is how those terminologies are used. So for instance, even looking at, you know, the increasing of trying to have the diversification of police, having police that are representative and that look like our communities. we're not asking for police that look like our communities, right? And even if they have some anti-racism training or something else in their toolkit, what we're really looking at, and something that may not be so popular among folks, as we move towards abolition, is, even talking about the intersectionality of capitalism and labor, really looking at a just transition away. There's many people that are stuck in policing that actually don't want to be police officers or part of that institution, but have no way out because we're stuck in this regime of capitalism. So having a just transition to have folks be able to leave that institution, while as remaining to have accountability measures for those who have and continue to perpetuate harm, it's something that definitely has to be more spoken about as we move towards complete abolition of the institution.
All right, Moya, I'm going to bring you into the conversation now as well. So what do you think, when we describe the general relationship here between racialized communities, law enforcement, and what we're missing in the conversation, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Shallima, and thank you. I'd also like to echo just my thanks to the Urban Alliance on Race Relations and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for the invitation. I don't have much to add to what has already been said. I agree with most of what's been said. I'll just say that over the past few years, there's been a focus on people's perceptions on the justice system generally and police in particular. In addition to the poll released by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation earlier this year, the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers released a report that found much the same thing. Black and Asian people view the police more negatively than white people, perceive much higher levels of police bias than white people, and the majority of white, Asian, and Black people believe that the police treat Black people much worse than white people. And there's a very good reason for those perceptions and beliefs, and that is racialized people do not believe the police are doing a good job because they aren't, right? The police are not doing a good job when it comes to members of Black communities, and we know this. And we have known this for a very long time. I could go back further, but even if we go back just 30 years to 1992, the Stephen Lewis report, in that report, he wrote that there was a palpable fear that he encountered from members of the Black community, particularly Black mothers, over unpredictable police encounters with Black youth, with one woman saying, quote, "Mothers see their sons walk out the door and they never sleep until their sons walk back in," end quote. And that fear stemmed from the fact that then, as now, police were killing and harming Black people. And we know that this still goes on. As was just mentioned, as recently as 2020, the Ontario Human Rights Commission found that members of the Toronto Police Service were more likely to seriously injure and kill Black people and far more likely to use low-level force against Black people. So in that sense, not a lot has changed in the last 30 years. What was for a long time missing from this conversation was imagination. And, Angela has just spoken about this, I think, quite eloquently. And what I mean by that is that there are segments of the population that are, in my opinion, rightly moving away from asking how can we reform or improve policing to why are we so focused on policing in the first place? Why are we flowing more money for studies, for consultations, for training, for oversight, for equipment, for body-worn cameras, for whatever else into policing when the police can only ever respond to crime? Why are we not working to prevent crime from happening in the first place if we are so focused on law and order, by focusing on what academics call the social determinants of justice: income, employment, stable housing, education, and health? What was missing from the conversation but isn't anymore is the high price that we pay, both literally and figuratively, for police. People are paying for their peace with their peace of mind, they're paying with their freedom, and they're paying with their lives. But they're also paying money for the policy decisions that politicians are making to fund affordable housing.
All right, lots of really, really interesting points, especially talking about those social determinants as well. I want to take us into that second portion of this discussion here. We're going to talk about individual reflections, barriers, and challenges as well. And I want to start off with Yusuf here, asking you specifically, what are some of the barriers that you have faced in your ongoing advocacy for reform within the justice system? Yusuf.
I sincerely apologize to everybody what I'm about to tell you. And I know everybody was warned about the graphic content. My late brother had 50 bruises on his body. Both his legs and his hands were tied. He was pepper sprayed twice. 6 guards would go in, 6 would go out in his spit hood. And they took turns beating him to death. The coroner's report said that Suleiman posed no threat in terms of, because his legs and his hands were tied. And what ended up happening when all of this happened over the course of 5 years, there's now 3 police investigations, 1 ministry internal investigation, 2 coroner's report, an eyewitness to Sully's killing. So I just want to lay that over that first before, and please, I'll put a link for everybody to hear more about the story if you don't know the story. Now let's talk about the barriers. You know, Moya said, my dear friend Moya said that, you know, mothers were worried about what happened to their son. My mother still to this day, when she visits his grave, talks about that last, you know, what did Sully suffer? How did Sully suffer, right? 5 years after they buried him, we're approaching the 5-year anniversary of his death. 5 years, right? They killed Sully in 2016. My family dies every day because of the lack of transparency and justice to give for my family. My late brother, who suffered from a severe illness known as schizophrenia, who 3 days before his death, I made arrangements in court for him to be transferred to a hospital. But they couldn't transfer him because there wasn't space for a bed. So to give that context and talk about the barrier has effectively been the opaqueness of the system. Time and time for the last 5 years, the police, you know, at the beginning of the case, the first local police who investigated the local jail. So the Lindsay police, the Court of Police Service, investigated the Lindsay jail. After they decided to not press charges, they said, we cannot give you the entire police report. We have to fight. We have to fight ourselves and our counsel. So the barrier of the opaqueness of the system. The other barrier of the fact that the system refuses and ruthlessly does not allow families to get their justice from the perspective of, you know, of getting accountability, because accountability, they're not used to or accustomed to being asked for accountability. Because if you ask yourself, how many guards, for example, or police officers are usually charged when somebody's beaten to death? Rarely. So the other barrier is the fact that the system's opaqueness does not allow for transparency because of the way the system in itself is created. Because there's this cultural thing that, oh, it's this idea that there is, as I mentioned in the beginning, in the first question, this idea that, you know, there's one standard for law enforcement and then the rest of us. And the barrier, we continue to face it. The case is now with the OPP for a third police investigation. The case got reopened a third time this August 2021. We don't know if they'll do the right thing. We don't know if they'll go press charges against the guards. And even if they do, Sully is no longer with us. There's already been enough damage to begin with. And so when I'm talking about reform, when I'm talking about the reform, don't just sit with us on the table and say we want to do this. Back it up by political action. Back it up by concrete, sincere efforts on how you're going to engage with the community, not lip service, not tokenism, right? So we're going to talk about, you know, the barrier of the reform that, you know, from my family. And I apologize to everybody, because when I talk about Sully, it's very hard and painful for me, because this was my brother at the end of the day. This was someone that I was raised with, that I loved so much. And when I keep talking about his life, and when I'm talking about like reforming the system, when the system refuses to get reformed, the biggest barrier in all of this is this inability for the system to allow families like us. And mind you, everybody, the last final point, Shallima, and I don't want to speak, you know, over time, is that imagine we were a First Nations family, or a single mother, or come from a certain socioeconomic background. How much harder it would be for them. You know, full disclosure for everybody here, I worked in the justice system. I was, you know, I know how the system operates from that perspective. You know, I speak English, right? I'm, you know, you know, imagine, you know, you come from a certain background, that there's certain barriers. how much harder it would be for them. I pay homage to those people more than even someone like myself, because they go even harder. Remember being that single mother. If we're having problems like this, what about other people? This is for the soul of our society. If we do not fix this problem, I will tell everybody this right now, especially when it comes to mental illness in the justice system, we will pay a price. Our kids and our grandkids will ask us of what we did. This is a life and death issue. This is not just a question of, making things better. This is a question of whether somebody can go spend dinner with their mother the next day, or whether somebody can go celebrate their birthday, rather being given to being put in graves. There's hundreds of Canadians that were killed as a result of the system. The perpetrators will never held accountable, yet the family members continue every single day to suffer through the pain. Thank you so much, Shallima.
Yusuf, thank you so much. I want to express our collective gratitude for you being so open with sharing the story. I know it is not easy for you, and I appreciate that. I do want to go back to something that you were talking about, and obviously you have been, you've been talking about mental health for a number of years now. When we talk about mental health, we also hear about, let's have a conversation, let's start a conversation. But what is going to be crucial going forward to steering this from a conversation to real, tangible action and change?
Well, Shallima, first of all, and thank you so much for your question. The people with mental illness, whether they suffer from whatever form of mental illness, they already suffer to begin with because of we talk about cultural conflict, even from our own respective communities, there's a cultural taboo, right? Whether it's from the Muslim community, the Jewish community, whether it's the Black community, the First Nations community, there's that. And my mom started the leadership when she forced us to accept Sully for who he was, right? My own community, sub-community has struggled. So that's the first part. Internally, we have a role to play in terms of embracing someone who's suffering from mental illness. Don't separate them, don't ostracize them. So that's the first part. That's our first work. And Sully was a gifted mind. He's a brilliant man. He actually taught me how to get closer to my faith. He taught my mom how to read, right? This is my brother. He was an engineer by trade, but sometimes we let the illness, be that whole person. They're not, they're much more richer than that. So that's the first part. That's our work internally within our respective communities. The second thing, people with mental illness should not be at the crossroads of the justice system. Police should not, or guards should not be within the parameters of the justice system. They should not be in the justice system. They should not be in jail. People with mental illness should not necessarily just be in institutions, but should be in certain cultural communities where people are able to understand those nuances that they come from. So that's the second thing. That's where the conversation should go. So more funding, for example, for wonderful organizations that can give those appropriate services, those services that have real tangible effect on making the Suleimans, the Andrew Lokus, the Pierre Corleons. And if anybody hears the sad story, the tragic story of Mature Madat, it's a very tragic story. He was killed by the Winnipeg police about 2 years ago. Sudanese descent, came to Canada as a refugee. He let several of his kids are now orphans. It's a very tragic story. And, he tried his best. And, one day with an episode, it ended his life. And so now imagine if there was an institution, I'll give him the appropriate services. And sometimes institutions, cultural organizations give those services, but there's no funding all too often. So there's this idea, Shallima, is that if we're going to, mental illness is a matter that affects all of us. We all have a stake in. All of us have a stake with mental illness because in one shape or form, we all have a link to mental illness, okay? And so we have to think about, in order to address this aspect, we have to put psychiatrists, social workers, nurses with cultural competency in institutions that have this to service them, right? My brother, you know what saved my late brother? Was in the form of his mother, my mother, who kept him alive for 11 years. It took the system 11 days to destroy what she built. He was diagnosed when he was 19 with schizophrenia. He died when he was 30. He was in jail for 11 days. We tried to visit him 4 times. The institution killed him. If the guards took his life, it's the institution that was responsible for his death. So we have to think about this idea a shift from this idea that people shouldn't be police, that should be the first responders when it comes to mental illness. As as my brother Mohamed said, and spoken about, and Moya spoke about this a little bit as well, is that there shouldn't be this enforcement when it comes to this idea, this combative nature. When somebody is having a mental health episode, what all too often they need is someone to listen to them, to hear them out, right? And when my brother had certain times when he had those episodes, we never called the police in terms of like when you have in the episode, my mom calmed him down. Imagine that, how novel of an idea, right? Mind my sarcasm, but it's this idea that we have to work hard to shift the focus from law enforcement in addressing mental illness, but cultural communities having the funding, having the wherewithal, and the opportunities to be able to address it. And they should not be the jail should not be the new hospitals. Unfortunately, they are. There's so many cases that we don't even know, but I read about it because I follow this through. There's so many cases. Thank you very much, Shallima.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And right now, for anybody who is just joining us, I want to welcome you to our discussion right now. I am going to turn things over to Mohamed here with this next question. What would you identify as the largest areas of priority for change in your police reform work?
Thanks, Shallima. And I think just to build on Yusuf's comments, I think it's precisely removing police from responding to what is really a health issue. As we know, 1 in 5 calls to 911 in our country relate to a mental health or addiction crisis. And we are sending police officers to respond to a health issue when we should be sending a better response. So one of the recommendations we made is we recommended to February to City Council, and it was adopted, that we pilot in 4 different areas the sending of peer workers, crisis workers, nurses, community-led mobile crisis response, and particularly for populations that are racialized, Black, and Indigenous, knowing the harms caused by a police response to some of these calls, and the need to have a non-police response. So in 2022, the city will be rolling out a pilot in 4 areas where 911 calls will be diverted to a mobile response. And the key is the response is embedded in community. We have to have a community-led response because the solutions are ground up. We can't be imposing them top down. So we're working with 4 community organizations to build up the mobile response, to hire the staff, and to build out the training and to create more public awareness around the alternative. On top of that, we know that our 911 call takers oftentimes send a police response because they don't know what other responses are available. So recently, the Toronto Police Services partnered with Gerstein Crisis Center to embed a crisis call taker in the 911 center to help divert calls from a police response to having a crisis call taker respond to the caller, connect them to the services they need, and to do follow-ups if necessary. At the end of the day, the reason we have police respond to these calls is we have dismantled and underfunded our community's capacity to respond. We have seen almost 3 decades of underinvestment and underfunding in our community organizations, and we have essentially left that the only response left, the response that's available 24/7, is a police response. And I think we need to shift away from that, and we're starting to see a shift away from that with the pilots that we'll be launching in 2022.
I know everyone will be watching very, very closely. Thank you very much for that. To Andrea now, I want to talk about the current status of policing in schools and what obstacles that you faced in your role at Police Free Schools.
Thank you. And I think before actually starting that, definitely want to ground ourselves in what at Lion we take up as our definition of police free schools, and we take up our US partners, the Alliance for Educational Justice definition. So I'm just going to read it out. And so this is the definition of police free schools, and I quote, dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. And I think what's really important about that, so when we're talking about status of policing in schools does not just mean police in school programs, right? There are a multitude of ways that students, even educators themselves and staff are policed. So students may be the way what hoops, what are they wearing, right? Their hair, how's their hair? Are they wearing natural hairstyles that are deemed unprofessional, right? Their body language, are they slouching on a chair? Does that automatically get taken up as being disrespectful, especially when we're in this hierarchy mode within an educational space, right? The tone of someone's voice, how that is being policed. And that's primarily based on, on what George Day calls a Black-white paradigm. The proximity to Blackness gets punished. Proximity to indigeneity gets punished, right? And whiteness isn't. We also see policing, just some few examples around, like within the virtual realm in regards to COVID, right? Like telling students to turn on their video, forcing them to turn on their video. Some students don't feel that they want to turn it on. Some of them don't want you to have a look into their home. They don't feel comfortable, right? Some students have been telling us that, some of their sessions have been getting recorded when supposedly they're not, right? And what does it mean by when within COVID, when educational spaces or even government institutions are providing, the technological instruments to students. We don't have any information in regards to data algorithm. We don't have any information in regards to is data being shared and so forth. And so I think primarily with us at LAN, so at LAN we have both a Police Free Schools Ontario provincial campaign and a Police Free Schools national campaign. Some of the big difficulties provincially is that we are very much aware that there is a provincial model for a local police and school board protocol. Something that Mitzi Hunter, when I even had asked in 2017, the day after the Toronto District School Board removed their SRO program to do a full removal provincially. Mitzi Hunter at that time, as the Liberal Minister of Education, took this off as this is a one moment. This is kind of like an individual issue. It's not a systemic issue, right? And whereas years later, even last year, trying to connect with the Conservative government, Veena Prasad, at that time acting director for Safe and Healthy Schools branch, on behalf of the Ministry of Education, stated the same thing. This is a local issue. This is not a systems issue. We have no jurisdiction. When then speaking with the Ontario Human Rights folks, they were saying, well, this is very much in their jurisdiction. So it's the lack of political will. We have people in seats that have the power to make the changes and they choose not to. Right, having been connected with the NDP Black Caucus, they have been the only political party who, within their policy paper, end police violence, invest in Black, Indigenous, and racialized people's lives, are the only ones who have actually put end police in schools. And so it's the political branches that we have been having a lot of difficulty with, but as well as when we're looking at police and school programs, School Resource Officer Program is the name that most folks know, right? All SRO programs are police and school programs, but not all police and school programs are SRO programs. We have, once again, Nithan had mentioned the recalibration of white supremacy and how, criminal punishment ways, I don't even call it criminal justice, but criminal punishment really recalibrates, right? It reinvents itself. And we see this with police and school programs. We have multitude of names, whether it be School Engagement Team Officers Program, School Engagement Team Officer Support Program, Student Officer Support Program. And so even looking at the multitude of names to kind of like this, Yusuf had mentioned like this opaqueness, to get folks to not be aware of what's actually happening. They just rename it, rebrand it. But we have amazing folks, even like nationally, folks who are working locally within their regions who have been getting amazing wins. We've had, Police Free Schools Winnipeg, who's had a huge win at the Winnipeg School Division. We've had No Cops in Schools get double wins at New Westminster Schools and Vancouver School Board in British Columbia. We've seen some wins also at the Upper Grand District School Board by Black Lives Matter Guelph. We've seen a huge win in Hamilton, Wentworth District School Board by Hamilton Students for Justice. We've seen wins in Waterloo Region District School Board by Black Brilliance Advisory Committee, also by African Caribbean Black Network of Waterloo Region. Ottawa Carleton District School Board by the Asilu Collective, among other ones, including TDSB that originally, catapulted, a push for further police-free schools in other spaces. And so there are wins, but also, once again, when my colleagues here on the panel have been talking about these nuances and complexities, it's quite the reality, because just as the TDSB removed their program, the Toronto Catholic District School Board reintroduced a school engagement team officer support program. We saw the Edmonton Police at the Edmonton Public School Division say we got rid of the SRO program, but we have a youth enhanced deployment model program, right? We've seen all of these kind of excuses to rebrand or rebranch off into other ways to ensure that policing and surveillance continues to happen. And so the push for police and policing-free schools continues to see a very high burnout of organizers that are on the ground, right? This is work that is free labor, that is being pushed by folks on the ground, frontline workers, students, educators themselves, folks who are just really looking to ensure that we have healthy educational spaces for everyone.
All right, thank you very much. And I do want to remind people, because I'm seeing a lot of messages popping up in the chat space, you are going to get to go into breakout rooms for more in-depth conversation. So your voices will be heard a little bit later on. So just moving things along here, I want to go to Moya here. I want to bring you in. Beyond policing alone, your work combats anti-Black racism in the justice system. So what are some of the systemic barriers that Black people face within other aspects of the justice system, and how do they connect to policing?
Thanks, Shallima. Thanks for the question. There's an article written by Joshua Seeley Harrington. He's a professor at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law. It's called Access to Injustice. And in that piece, he writes, quote, popular fictions of neutrality obscure how we have not a rule of law, but rather what Dr. Pamela Pomander calls a law of rulers. We are ruled by whites, by men, by dominant norms, which our courts so often unwittingly participate in. Look, for example, at our racist penal, housing, and drug policy. Simply put, when racism is the law, access to courts is definitionally incapable of bringing access to justice, end quote. And there are a number of policies and procedures and practices that unfairly discriminate and can prevent Black people from participating fully in society. There are a number of examples of this in the criminal justice system. For example, the things that courts consider mitigating and aggravating factors in sentencing, the factors that parole boards consider when assessing the risk presented by a person. And those are just a few examples, but I'll give you one example, which relates to a project that we're working on right now at the Black Legal Action Center. In fact, just this morning, we launched the Fresh Start Coalition and campaign, and that is with respect to record suspensions. So I talked earlier about the social determinants of justice. I mentioned income, employment, stable housing, education, and health. And these are things that if you don't have them, they increase your likelihood of becoming caught up in the criminal justice system. What's interesting is that having a criminal record makes it harder to find a job, get educational opportunities, and secure housing. And while we have a process for getting record suspensions, it is so expensive and so onerous that people don't do it. As an example, you have about 10,000 people who could be eligible to apply for cannabis record suspension program that was introduced in 2019. But as of last month, only 484 record suspensions have been granted, and that's less than 1%. And here is how this is linked to policing. When the Ontario Human Rights Commission looked at data from the Toronto Police Service, Black people represented 4 in 10 people involved in cannabis charges, despite conviction rates and many studies showing that they use cannabis at exactly the same or similar rates to white people. So of those 10,000 people who could be eligible for cannabis record suspensions, they are also going to be disproportionately Black and disproportionately Indigenous. And as a result, even if the process is exactly the same for everyone, even if the record suspension process is exactly the same for everyone, even if there isn't a single biased decision maker in the process, the result is going to be unfair. And so the Black Legal Action Center, together with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the John Howard Society, and about 60 other community organizations, has formed the Fresh Start Coalition and campaign to essentially say there shouldn't be an application process. It shouldn't cost money. It shouldn't require an application. It should just be automatic, because why not? So that's just one example.
And I'll tell you one thing, I want to continue this conversation for a long, long time, but I know we're going to move into the next portion of our discussion. So thank you very, very much for that, Moya. We're going to go into this final leg of the conversation, which is all about solutions. So Mohamed, I'm going to start with you. And I want to start off with this question about your work right now. What progress have you seen in reimagining public safety in Canada's largest city?
Thanks, Shallima. And I think I've already highlighted the work of the Community Crisis Support Service pilots that will be rolling out in 2022. But to build on that, I think I'll just highlight just two quick examples of broader police accountability, which is an ongoing piece of work. One is we've all seen, or maybe you haven't seen, the recent MOU between the Ombudsman Toronto and Toronto Police Services that is being finalized. This MOU is an example, or this approach is an example of a non-police entity being involved in providing greater accountability over police services. And this is a trend we're starting to see in other cities. There's an example also in Peel region with the MOU with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And this is a call that a lot of activists and community members have highlighted, that there needs to be a broader consideration of police accountability that doesn't necessarily involve institutions that have police involved in them for providing that accountability. The other piece I'll highlight is generally all cities in Ontario have to supply a community safety and wellbeing plan, and the City of Toronto submitted our 10-year plan that was adopted in July. In that plan, it's really a conversation around how do we move away from enforcement towards prevention. And in that plan, it highlights some of the key areas the city needs to look at in terms of advancing truth and reconciliation, in terms of advancing a trauma-informed city, in terms of identifying the needs that people need so they don't fall into crisis and don't fall into the intersection of policing and justice. So that obviously it's easy to have a plan. The hard work comes implementing that plan. But I think it's a sign of the right direction that the city has highlighted with the community safety and wellbeing plan. I'm just reminded, I'll just quickly end with this, the quote of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who highlighted that, when people keep falling into the river, it's about time that we go up the river and find out why. And I think when we talk about policing, we're down the river and we're using the wrong response. We need to go upstream and dismantle the structural inequalities, the structural challenges that the other panelists have highlighted that lead people to fall into the river and provide people with the support they need to thrive.
All right, thank you for that, Mohamed. Next, I want to go back to you, Moya. You've delivered anti-racism training, obviously, to hundreds of judges. We talked about justices of the peace, lawyers, and other professionals within the justice system. What has the experience overall for you been like? And what are some of the key principles that you hope to impart to participants who are working in the justice system?
So I know that training gets kind of a bad rep, but my view on these things is that, these things aren't mutually exclusive. We should be taking to the streets and advocating for systemic change at the same time as we are trying to ensure that the actors in the justice system are, making unbiased decisions. Anti-Black racism is pervasive and it's pernicious. And I've often said that trying to not be influenced by anti-Black racism is like trying to swim in water and not get wet. It is just not possible. And if we accept this, and study after study after study has documented the ways in which anti-Black racism manifests in everything from, who kindergarten teachers watch, to how employers decide who gets a job interview, to how doctors decide who to try to heal or whose limbs to amputate. And these are all, research studies that have been done, and they all show us that it is everywhere. And so if we accept this, and I don't think it's too much of a leap to accept that we, and that means justice system actors, including judges, including justices of the peace, including lawyers, also have internalized anti-Black racism and are at the risk of making biased decisions on that basis. That's one of the key principles that I try to impart on the people working in the justice system, that none of us is immune, and that you don't automatically stop having biases because you've been appointed to the bench. So humility and acceptance. The other key principle that I'm working to sort of impart on the justice system actors is, as good of a facilitator as I may be, attending one training session or watching one documentary or reading one report is not going to rid you of your biases, and is not going to sort of fix the justice system. It's just the starting point. So we are, bombarded on an almost daily basis, multi-daily basis rather, about messages about Black people, particularly poor Black people are inferior, they're not smart, they're dangerous. And this happens in subtle and sometimes very obvious ways. And unless we are engaged in a daily practice of combating these messages, unless we are setting up processes and checks and balances to mitigate the impact that these biases have on our decision-making processes, things will continue as they are. And so to this end, I, together with Pamela Chapman, who's a legal educator, have been working to create and encourage judges and justices of the peace and regulators and adjudicators to use a tool that's referred to as bench cards. And it's been used in American courts and with positive results. And the third principle is that, changing our practices will only take us so far. We have to look at our laws. We have to look at our policies as well. We have to consider who has been centered in them and who has been marginalized by them. We have to think critically about the idea that the law is not something that was handed down from on high and is therefore beyond reproach. The law is man-made. It reflects the worldviews, the beliefs, and very importantly, the interests of the men that made them. And if we don't do this, if we're not honest about what is really going on, we will have a reckoning. I'm not the only person that thinks this. Former Supreme Court Justice Beverly McLaughlin, in a speech that she gave in 2019, said, public confidence in the justice system slides. It becomes easier and easier to say we don't need lawyers and court proceedings, and the rule of law is weakened and begins to founder. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Finally, I'm just going to put the last question here to Andrea before we move into some closing remarks and move everybody all into the breakout rooms. So Andrea, the final question here, how can parents and students be involved in advocating around the issue of police in schools and its impact on racialized students?
Thank you. Yeah, first off, definitely recognizing the power of their voice and the power of them committing to action and organizing collectively. One of the things that can be done, whether it be in a very small group or larger group, building up awareness. The amount of times that we have spoken with folks that had no idea that they had, particular police and school programs within their own educational spaces. So definitely a foundational piece is building up awareness so that parents, caregivers, guardians, educators, and students themselves are aware as to what they're dealing with. What are like the frequently asked questions? What's that particular police and school program's name? How can we remove this via school board and so forth? Definitely, looking at information sessions within their own communities. But even aside from that, documenting their own stories. We did that in regards to youth when looking to push for the removal at the Toronto District School Board. And that win was sought out by, work that was done by Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty for about a decade, work by LAN, by Black Lives Matter Toronto, and so forth. And so making up those coalition pieces when that is something that, that permits within their own space, but also looking at their lived experiences as lived expertise and not being told that their lived experience are just anecdotal stories. They're not anecdotal stories. It is qualitative data that must be taken into account, and even so forth, even pushing their own school boards and their own senior staff and even directors of their education to look at the new Westminster School in British Columbia that actually looked at the previous reports and actually said, we don't need more data. We don't need more reports. There is more than enough data. There is more than enough reports. Why are we going to be re-traumatizing students, re-traumatizing youth? Rather, understand that this is a systemic issue, that no school board is exempt regardless of what their police in school program is named after, regardless of their student community, regardless of their own school board, right? So the reality that they can commit to political will if they so choose to. And definitely also, you know, looking at connecting with us at La N.
Oh, Andrea, I think we just lost your mic there.
Hello? Oh, perfect. Yeah, so definitely connecting with us at La N in regards to whether it be our provincial campaign or our national campaign, where we're able to elevate and support each other, be in community with each other, because in many instances, this work is very, very lonely and isolating in so many times. And also looking at, you know, even myself outside of La N, but also in connection with, as an electoral political organizer, you know, provincial elections in Ontario are coming up. You know, the education piece is provincial jurisdiction. So for police free schools are organizing around electoral political parties to ensure that this is an issue that is being looked at as a powerful electoral political issue to get voted in. Definitely also connect with us, because this is something that really has to be done to ensure that, you know, we're not going from school board to school board to school board because white supremacy wants us to tire out. We need a systemic change and a provincial political will to do that.
Right. Okay, this brings us to the conclusion. I think I am still muted. Okay, no, that's good. All right, so this brings us to the end of our discussion. A lot of really great insights, and I know you're all going to be eager to get into those break rooms.